Empire. Continuing our NFL draft education with the help of an old friend. What's up, everybody? It's Mike Jones. Thanks for coming back for another episode of the Football Jones podcast. You can read me at usatoday.com. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at @ByMikeJones. And today, our guest is Jordan Reid, senior NFL draft analyst for the draftnetwork.com. If you remember, we had Jordan Reid on the podcast last year after the Combine. Unfortunately, no Combine this year because of COVID, but still wanted to catch up with Jordan so that way he could help give us some insight. For a little refresher on his background, former college quarterback, played D1 ball, also coached for several years before now getting into the world as a sports analyst. And he is full of a lot of insight, really does a great job of breaking it down, but also maintaining balance and objectivity. I think that when you hear him talk, you're kind of seeing it through the eyes of a scout, somebody that's not invested in these guys that, you know, he sees the good, he sees the bad, he tells it all, and he's fair. So as we've been discussing this draft and how quarterback heavy it is, I wanted to get his perspective on Justin Fields, on Zach Wilson, little on Trey Lance, and then also talk to him about some other guys that don't play quarterback that we should be looking out for in the draft. And after that, I've got a few other draft reporting nuggets on these quarterbacks that I've gathered over the last couple weeks. And so let's first get into it with Jordan Reid.
Hey, what's up? It's your man Ray from the Urban Sports Scene. Check us out each and every Tuesday at 8 p.m. where we cover the hottest topics from the world of hoops, football, baseball, boxing, and all things DC sports. For our unique take on sports plus exclusive interviews, subscribe to the Urban Sports Scene wherever you listen to your favorite podcast and check out all the great shows on Empire Media.
And here we are with Jordan Reid, senior NFL draft analyst for the Draft Network. Jordan, how you doing, man?
Mike, it's always a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me.
Hey, I'm glad that we could get you back on here. You know, last year we caught up at the Combine. This year, obviously, no Combine, but I still wanted to get your expertise as we've been the last couple of weeks focusing on the quarterbacks in this year's draft because there's such a strong class. But I also wanted to get your take on some of the other guys in there as well to help educate us as we head towards the draft. So real quick, can you kind of give me an overview? Let's start with the quarterbacks. Obviously, we know Trevor Lawrence is number one, but as far as the other guys in the draft, how do you see the top five quarterbacks? How do you rank them?
Yeah, so everybody pretty much knows that Lawrence is going to be the top number one overall pick by the Jacksonville Jaguars. I mean, Urban Meyer was in the huddle at the Clemson Pro Day when he had his Pro Day back in March, I believe it was. So Trevor's going to be the top guy. After that, for me, is Justin Fields. He's my second-ranked quarterback. I like him the best of the bunch in that top tier, and I think that top tier is really composed of Lawrence, Fields, and then Zach Wilson, who's kind of been like the Joe Burrow type of player that really came out of nowhere this year. He had like 5th and 6th round grades coming into the year, was coming off a year that wasn't very promising for the most part. There wasn't a lot of excitement about him. But as you can see, he toured last year and he played really well for the most part. And now a lot of people are thinking that he's probably going to go number 2 to the New York Jets. So between those three, those really are made up of the top tier that I would like to say. After that, you're getting into Trey Lance, who's created a lot of excitement about himself, even though he has a very small sample size, him and Mac Jones, which make up that second tier of quarterbacks. After that, both of them only have 17 career starts as a whole, which is a very small sample size as well. And, you know, they're going to be in very uncharted territory just because since the year 2000, I believe it was, there's only been 4 other quarterbacks that have went on to have 17 or less career starts and to go on to be first round selections. And it's Kyler Murray, Mark Sanchez, Mitchell Trubisky, and Dwayne Haskins. So as you can see, very mixed bag as far as how those guys have turned out. So they're going to be a very good litmus test.
So can you tell us how Zach Wilson went from, you know, like you said, 5th, 6th, round grades to having a good season, but now a lot of people have him as number 2 going to the Jets. How did that happen? I mean, obviously he played well, but still, what do you attribute that strong a rise for him?
Well, I think the big thing that Zach did was he just understood the difference between ball placement and accuracy. And you see the big time completion percentage numbers, but I think completion percentage can kind of be a little bit misleading because it doesn't really paint the whole picture as a whole, just because whenever a guy completes a pass, it just gets marked down as a completion. But with ball placement, you starting to see him putting the ball on the right shoulders, him leading guys up the field, putting it in right places away from the defense. So his accuracy got much better. And of course, whenever you have a big time prospect like that, he's going to get more TV games. And we know with TV games comes with exposure. He seemed to be on ESPN every single week. And, with that conference, they play late nights pretty much. And, on the East Coast, a lot of people are asleep when a lot of games in that conference are played out there in the Mountain West. But a lot of people were staying up to see him play. Even in the bowl game when they played against UCF, a lot of people were really tuned in for him and what was pretty much a finale for his career. So I think it's an embodiment of his accuracy and then just being showcased on TV a little bit more as well.
Now, we've heard some comparisons to Aaron Rodgers, Patrick Mahomes, because he throws the ball from all different angles. He can make jump passes and all kinds of things like that. Do you think that's accurate? And how do you kind of see him? Who does he remind you of?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like comparing guys to, Aaron Donald and Patrick Mahomes, just because those guys are what I like to call aliens. You don't see a lot of people gracing the earth that have their talent. So I wouldn't go as far as Aaron Rodgers or Patrick Mahomes, but you see a lot of similar qualities as far as the off-platform throws, him playing the game essentially like a shortstop in a sense with those funky arm angles and, disconnecting his upper body from his lower body and being able to throw from some of those funky platforms that he does. But I think his awareness is really high. He has really good accuracy down the field and in the short to intermediate areas as well. From everybody that I talked to, they said he's a very smart individual as well. And that was one of the biggest reasons of why he really took that bump up in his development.
Now, he had a really impressive pro day. But what did you take away from that performance that you saw?
Well, I mean, I don't really put a whole bunch of stock into pro days. I think it's really kind of for fans as opposed to evaluators in my sense, just because it's scripted and they know exactly what's coming. And it's just a matter of them going out and executing. I think that's something that everybody just wants to see them do. You see that, he went like, let's say 60 or 65 and it's 60 of 65 in his pro day. So it's just a matter of executing. And I think one thing you can take away from pro days is that it's a little bit different seeing quarterbacks throw in person as opposed to on TV, just because you want that kind of confirmation of, yeah, this guy can spin it and you want to see it on your own. So I think just being able to see it actually in person, that's going to help them a lot.
Okay. So what is it that scares you or concerns you about him? Is there anything that kind of worries you about him?
The injury situations, I think that's something that a lot of people really aren't aware of with him. He's had shoulder surgery already on his throwing shoulder and then his throwing thumb as well. I think that happened in 2019 coming into the 2019 season. And he's not a big guy either. He's about 6'2", 205 pounds. He's not an overly big type of quarterback either. And then at BYU, I mean, that offensive line, they protected him very well. He was throwing from a lot of clean pockets as well. So on the next level, he's really going to be challenged as far as throwing off script, throwing off platform, and having to avoid defenses. And, whenever you're a first round pick and you're labeled as like the next guy for a franchise, these defenders, they're going to probably be coming after you every week. So he's going to have a target on his back as far as, a lot of people are going to want to sack him and do well against him as well.
Now, I've asked a couple guys about this, but what do you think as far as the competition, the level that they played on, their conference they were in, and that he faced? Is it going to be a steep jump to the NFL? I mean, we've obviously seen quarterbacks go from smaller schools and play well, but how do you think that transition will be for him?
I think it will be initially, just because whenever you go from playing Coastal Carolina and some of these other defense that he did face, obviously the speed of the game is going to be much different. But I think as he continues to get in-game reps and he just gets more familiarity with his surroundings and then Michael LaFleur's scheme and then everything that's asked of him, I think he'll be just fine. But I think kind of the soft schedule was taking a little bit away from what he did a year ago, because I just like to say good throws are good throws no matter what level he's playing on. If you're going out there and executing, he's not the athletic director. He's not responsible for setting up the games. He can't control who's on the schedule. All he can do is go out there and execute, and that's exactly what he did.
All right, so tell me about Justin Fields. You've got him as your second quarterback in your rankings. This guy had, put up crazy numbers in college. Why do you think that he has almost slid in the evaluations from what we've seen so far? I mean, he did well in his pro day, season, he obviously, was very successful. But what do you attribute that to?
Well, Mike, honestly, every year there's a prospect that turns out to be a punching bag for the media. And it's kind of like evaluators and the media are on two different spectrums. We saw it with Daniel Jones a couple of years ago. We've seen it with plenty of other players. Lamar Jackson is another great example. That was a punching bag in a sense. So I think it's just kind of people being exhausted a little bit leading up to the draft and just kind of floating out narratives, whether it's if a team wants them to slip, they're floating it out there, or they simply are just seeing stuff that they do not see. I'm a big fan of Justin Fields personally. And I mean, I think he has every single intangible and tool that you want in a quarterback. Now, he does need to be coached up a little bit as far as I think he tries to be a little bit too perfect at times, and he tries to be a perfectionist. And he does some things that he doesn't need to do that I think he needs to clean up a little bit as far as his reads. And everybody talks about, him only being a one read quarterback. I don't see that at all. It's just a matter of him trying to be too perfect in some situations, and he needs to get off of those reads a little bit earlier than what he does. So I mean, if I was San Francisco at 3, I would be happy. If he's there for me, I would run and turn that pick in if I were them. So I like Justin Fields a lot, a player that had to overcome some adversity, initially starting his career at Georgia, where he was mainly treated as a Wildcat quarterback. He lost out to Jake Fromm there initially. So he had to go into an entirely new locker room, a big-time program like Ohio State, and he won over the locker room immediately. We saw what he did in the college football playoff Clemson, initially breaking his ribs in that game and still having the game of his career, throwing 6 touchdowns and then going against Alabama. And he wasn't 100%, but he still went out there and competed and played well for the most part. So this would be a player that I would firmly welcome in my locker room as the face of my franchise.
Now, he's got a little bit of a knock that he has to, it's not fair to him, but the track record of Ohio State quarterbacks. One guy, talent evaluator I talked to said, Ohio State quarterbacks tend to be slower processors because of the offense that they run there and then going to the NFL and the complexities of those offenses. How do you feel about that? And I know there's like keywords and triggers and all kinds of things that you have to be mindful of, when there's all these evaluations. But did you see enough from him that gives you belief that, okay, yes, he ran this kind of offense there, but he can handle this pro style offense, day in and day out?
Yeah, and I wrote about this back in January just because I knew this was going to come eventually. And this question is kind of twofold for me, and I'll break it down into 2 parts. So how Fields is different from previous Ohio State quarterbacks is one that, okay, so I'll name some of the guys that we've seen coming out of Ohio State in previous years. Terrell Pryor, Troy Smith is another name. Dwayne Haskins is another. These guys were taught to play the quarterback positions as predominantly athletes, if that makes sense. So they were really like the best athletes on the field, but they didn't have a lot of polish coming into playing the quarterback position. But with Fields, he's already polished enough, and he already has the savvy and awareness of playing the position to where I think he's going to translate just fine on the next level. So with Terrell Pryor, Troy Smith, Cardale Jones, JT Barrett, all these guys, they were good athletes, but they didn't necessarily understand how to play the quarterback position at an NFL caliber level. Braxton Miller is another great example that eventually moved to another position like Terrell Pryor. So that just goes to show you that Urban Meyer was trying to teach them the position as athletes as opposed to already being polished quarterbacks. With Fields, he already has that in hand as far as him being a really good athlete and already having the savvy enough to play the quarterback position at the high level on the next level. And then the mobility factor. A lot of people like to compare him to Dwayne Haskins. I think they're in 2 stratospheres as far as the athleticism and the mobility. So that's how I think he differentiates from Haskins. And then whenever you talk about mobility, I think that's a necessity when you're talking about young quarterbacks entering the league. And if you go back to the 2018 class, I believe it was, with, Josh Rosen and Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Sam Darnold, and Baker Mayfield, think about all these guys that didn't have the mobility. Just talking about Josh Rosen, he was the one that didn't necessarily work out with the bunch. And even the young quarterbacks that are entering the league now, Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert and Kyler Murray, all these players are able to make the offensive coordinator right, even when they call the wrong play, just because they have that mobility. And these are assets and characteristics that Justin Fields gives you walking through the door.
So for him, I know you said that if you were the 49ers at number 3, you would run to the podium with that pick right there. Would it be best for him to go somewhere where he's got not only a strong, roster around him, but a veteran that he can sit behind? Or do you think that he can handle starting from day one?
I think he can handle starting from day one, just because, yes, I know the offense at Ohio State isn't necessarily pro friendly. They don't run a lot of pro concepts as far as what Ryan Day was trying to do, and even Urban Meyer. But I think with how well he plays the position, there's going to be some things, like I said, that it needs to be coached upon. But, you hear people say that he can recite information very well. We know he can go out there and execute things as well. And then he has the mobility as well. But I think the 49ers are a great situation with him, just because the 3 things that I think you have to have for young quarterbacks, and I like to refer to this as 3 Ps. You have to have protection, you have to have play callers, and you have to have playmakers. The 49ers check all 3 of those boxes right away. They have Kyle Shanahan, who's already labeled as one of the better offensive play callers in the league. We know they have one of the better offensive lines in the league. They re-signed Trent Williams, and they have plenty of others along the offensive line as well. We know they have playmakers as well: Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, and there's plenty of others as well on that offense. So I think if he's able to step into the situation with the Jimmy Garoppolo, who he can learn behind, but we know Jimmy G hasn't been healthy the past few years, so he could get his opportunity in an instant.
Now, one thing that kind of confuses me as we hear in this draft season is people were saying, oh, Mac Jones, Kyle Shanahan, he's the perfect kind of quarterback for him. Are we forgetting that Kyle Shanahan had RG3, who is one of the most athletic quarterbacks ever, and he had a record-breaking rookie season? I think that if Kyle Shanahan got his hands on Justin Fields, that he would have a field day with his ability. Yes, obviously they have their base offense, but I think there'd be a whole lot of creative things that Kyle Shanahan would do with him that he could give him more. Fields could give him more than what Mac Jones could give him. Am I wrong there?
No, I think you're exactly right. And I think you were actually in the middle of all that during your time at Washington. So you saw what he was able to do with an athletic quarterback. And, we see these waves of news and trends throughout draft season. You saw it with Mac Jones potentially going number 3. There seemed to be every single media outlet talking about him potentially going number 3, like put it in Sharpie. But I just never believed it, just because going back to the RG3 days, and for whatever reason, everybody forgets that Kyle really had a lot of success with RG3. And, everybody likes to bring up Kirk Cousins and some of these other players that he has had that are more of your less type of mobile quarterbacks and more of your pocket passer or prototypes. But I think with Justin Fields, he can get back to some of the things that he did with RG3 and having that mobile type of quarterback playing at a high level. And then also something that a lot of people really aren't thinking is you have to think about this division now as well. At the NFC West, you have Kyler Murray, Russell Wilson, and now Matthew Stafford. So is Mac Jones ever going to be any better than any of those 3 guys? I just don't see it. That's why I think the upside of Justin Fields, you could eventually get to the level of those 3 guys.
All right. So we'll touch on quickly the Trey Lance and Mac Jones. What do you think of those 2 guys? What do you think that where do they project, and what's their ceilings?
I like Trey Lance a lot. He's my 4th ranked quarterback right now. It's just the sample sizes that scare you a little bit about him, the 17 career games. And that stat I floated out a little bit earlier, you saw how it was a mixed bag of individuals, of how their careers turned out in a sense. But you talk about a player that has every single tool that you love to see at the position, but he is a little bit raw right now just because of that small sample size. Only played 1 game last year in the showcase game against Central Arkansas. And he was a little bit up and down in that game. He didn't have any interceptions in his career prior to that point, which I think is a little bit misleading. A little bit. There were some games during his redshirt freshman year that were some interceptable passes that teams just simply dropped. So they kind of handcuffed him a little bit in the offense. You see a lot of 12 and 11 personnel as far as heavy tight end sets, condensed sets, heavy play action, a dominant run game in a sense too. So he only had 2 games in his career of where he had over 25 passing attempts. So that just goes to show you that the game wasn't really put in his hands a whole bunch either. So the NFL game is going to be a little bit of an adjustment for him. And I would like to see him go to a situation of where he could sit behind an experienced veteran and, be on that kind of Patrick Mahomes type of plan of where they just ease him in. And I'm not saying he's going to end up like Mahomes, but just talking about the type of plan that the Chiefs had him on, sitting him behind Alex Smith and allowing him to start that final Week 17 game during his rookie year. And, Atlanta, I think that would be a really good situation for him at number 4 overall, but we'll see what they end up doing.
Gotcha. And Mac Jones, from what I hear, great as far as making decisions, diagnosing defenses and things like that, but just an average athlete. What do you make of him?
Yeah, I think Mac is really talented as far as from a pocket passer. He's a little bit better athlete than given credit for. As you saw at his pro day, he's a wizard inside the pocket as far as avoiding pressure, keeping his eyes down the field, and just being what I like to call the mailman. You just put the package on the doorstep and it doesn't matter what you do after that. That's none of your business. And that's what he did at Alabama. He had a lot of weapons around him with Jalen Waddle, Devonta Smith, and then some other players we'll hear about in future years that are going to end up being high draft picks. Really good offensive line. They ended up winning the Joe Moore Award, which is awarded to the best offensive line in the country. And once again, it goes back to those 3 Ps as far as protection, play callers, and then playmakers as well. That's something that you absolutely have to have with Mac Jones, just because compared to Justin Fields and Trey Lance, he doesn't have that mobility of where he can get himself out of harm's way consistently as far as outside of the pocket.
Now, but did he have too much to work with? I mean, you don't have that abundance of riches on every NFL roster. How is he gonna, handle that jump? And then, if you're on an early team, lots of times your roster is going to be kind of thin.
That's the big worry with him, just because you have to have an ultimate arsenal of weapons with him. Otherwise, you're not going to see him to his full potential, just because, like I said earlier, he doesn't have the potential to make the offensive coordinator right if they put him in those bad situations. And he did it at Alabama from time to time. But once again, the setup was so good for him there of where all he had to do was dump it off to, Najee Harris or Devonta Smith or Jalen Waddle. But let's say he goes somewhere like a New England or somebody like that. They don't have those embarrassment of riches consistently on the perimeter like he had at Alabama. So that's always going to be your biggest worry with him, the mobility factor, and if he can uplift the supporting cast, even if it's not up to par.
All right. So breaking away from quarterbacks, that was such a great breakdown right there. I really appreciate you doing that for us. And I think one of the probably most balanced and measured breakdowns that we've gotten so far leading up to the draft. But let's look at other guys now. Obviously, number 2 on your big board is Kyle Pitts, and the tight end from Florida. But is he really a tight end, or should we just call him a playmaker, a pass catcher?
And this is something that I say to everybody. Don't worry about the 2 letters in front of his name, whether it's W-R or T-E. He's an all of the above player, just because whatever position you put him at, he's going to go out there and execute. He had a talented quarterback at Florida and Cal Trask, and they just really lobbed the ball up to him, and they used him all over the place. He can play in line, what's called from the hip of the offensive tackle. You can flex him out wider. You can flex him out on the perimeter. There's so many different things that you can do with him. And just to kind of paint a picture of what he could be on the next level, but even a more athletic version, Darren Waller from the Las Vegas Raiders, who had a big time season last year, I think he can be a similar player as far as a main contributor and even a top flight option on a receiving core for a quarterback.
So where's a good spot for him? I mean, any team would probably love to have him, but I mean, do you think that that's somewhere Atlanta snatches him up, or do you think he goes a little bit further? I guess if Atlanta takes a quarterback, but say Atlanta doesn't take a quarterback. I mean, I think Matt Ryan would love to have him, but where do you see him going?
Yeah, a lot of defensive coordinators are going to be up late at night if they have to game plan for Julio, Calvin Ridley, and Kyle Pitts. So I think Matt Ryan would really appreciate that. I don't see him making it past Miami at 6, honestly. I would be really surprised if he gets past them, just because Miami made the trade back to 12 and then exchanged picks back up to 6 with Philadelphia. So they have somebody in mind that they really like at that 6th pick, and it wouldn't surprise me if it is Kyle Pitts. I like that landing spot for him, just because Tua has to have some weapons on the perimeter. And like I talked about earlier, you want to surround your quarterback with as many weapons as possible, and Kyle Pitts definitely is a dangerous one.
Sewell is another guy. Excuse me, Penei Sewell is another guy you've got rated pretty high. What do you like about him? Is there any concern about him as far as having, opted out?
I don't know. I don't have any concerns about him. He didn't need to play this year. We know what Penei Sewell is if he played this year, even if he didn't play this year. Very talented individual, going to enter the NFL game at only 20 years old. Doesn't turn 21 until October. So as far as athleticism, that's something that really stands out about him. Very athletic individual, very powerful as well. I think he can be a day one starter at tackle or guard. It doesn't really matter. Wherever you put him at, he's going to make your offensive line better from day one. Balance is something that can be a little bit of an issue with him, but it's just a matter of him being a little bit over aggressive and excited going into blocks. So there's not a lot of holes overall in this game, and I would be surprised if he gets past. I think probably his floor is probably the Panthers at 8.
Okay. Now, is there somebody that's kind of a dark horse, somebody that we're not talking about that you expect is going to really wind up being a star in this draft that is, like I said, overlooked a little bit maybe?
Well, he's not overlooked anymore. I talked about him about a month ago. His name is Jalen Davis from Kentucky. He's a linebacker, and he went out at Kentucky's pro day, and he's 6'4", 240 pounds. He ran 4.37 and jumped 42 inches in the vertical. So he's a player that I think is probably going to skyrocket, or is already skyrocketing up boards, and I think he's going to end up being a first-round pick. It wouldn't surprise me if he goes to, Cleveland at 26 or the Washington football team at 19. They're in search for a linebacker if they don't elect to take a quarterback or offensive tackle. So I think he's going to end up going somewhere in the first round. It wouldn't surprise me if, he makes a huge ascension and he ends up being a top 20 selection just based off what he did at the pro day and then what he put on tape last year.
Now, you had tweeted about the HBCU Combine. The NFL had planned on having one of these things last year. COVID canceled it. They were planning this year. COVID canceled it, but there was still a group that got together and put on a combine for players from HBCU schools. Who stood out at that for you? And is there anybody that you feel like really has a chance to, be snatched up semi-early in the draft and make a name for himself?
Well, the two highest rated players at the HBCU Combine were Franklin McMcCain, the third from North Carolina A&T. He was a cornerback, and he was labeled as one of the top FCS players overall coming into the year. A player that I've, developed a little bit of a relationship with, being a North Carolina Central grad myself. I'm not fond of that school over there in Greensboro. That's our rivals, but, I have to give credit where credit is due. But he's a really good player. He went over to NC State and actually participated in their pro day there. Just because they wanted to make things easier on scouts this year to where they didn't have to go or jump from school to school. And then he was playing on a bigger platform as well. NC State has a couple of prospects that are higher ranked this year as well. So he was able to get some good eyes on evaluators. And then he wanted to go down to Birmingham, Alabama this past weekend and run as well. And he performed really well, ran in the 4.4s just like he did at NC State. So keep an eye on him. And also another is Donnie Corley. He's a wide receiver from Texas Southern. He originally started his career at Michigan State. He had over 400 yards his first year there. He had a bit of a hiccup off the field. And then he ended up getting kicked off the team and he transferred to Texas Southern after attending a junior college and only played 1 year there, but had over 1,000 yards and 70 catches and then 4 touchdowns. So he's a player that is probably going to end up being an undrafted free agent just because of what happened at Michigan State, but I think he's going to be a very high quality undrafted free agent. And then, just the HBCU Combine platform as a whole, I think is huge just because I've had experience with HBCUs being a former starting quarterback at North Carolina Central and then coaching there for 5 years. So I have a lot of connections and I know a lot as far as the HBCU game, but there's a lot of hidden gems there. And my job and something that I promised myself that I wanted to do was that just create more notoriety for them just because there's a lot of talented players and, Javon Hargrave and Darius Leonard and Tariq Cohen, players that I had the privilege of playing and then coaching against as well. It shouldn't be a lot of people's first time hearing of them when they hear their names on draft day. So that's why I think like the HBCU Legacy Bowl, which is something that I'm hoping that I can get on the selection committee of, just because I'm very fond of a lot of players that are playing in the HBCU game, and I want to make sure that they get the best product on the field as possible as far as the players that are representing the event, considering that it's on NFL Network, a big stage for them, and in its inaugural year next year after the Super Bowl, the first Saturday after the Super Bowl. I want to make sure they get the right people on the field that are firmly deserving of that notoriety as well. So I'm really excited about it, as you can tell.
Yeah, no, and I think that's going to be huge. And Doug Williams and those guys getting that thing put together and the league backing that. Do you feel like we're about to see a surge in HBCU programs? I mean, obviously Dion coaching down there has given them exposure. We got Eddie George, who's about to take over a head coaching program position for an HBCU as well. What do you see as the future for these schools?
I think it's huge. And, Dion kind of paved the way as far as former successful NFL players coming to programs. Eddie George now taking over at Tennessee State, a program that's been a little bit down over the past few years. And I love that these programs really aren't worrying about as far as the head coaching resume. They're just trying to get some people that are going to bring some notoriety to the programs, but also getting the right people in there as well. We're seeing Jackson State games on ESPN every weekend now, which is really good, just because I think something that's really been lacking with HBCU ball is just the lack of exposure. As you know, games really came on ESPN3, but you have to log onto your phone and really see those games. But whenever you're on ESPN1 and ESPN2, that's more of a bigger platform, just because you're on TV actually for those fans to see. And then it's been a good product. Every single game that Jackson has played on TV this year has been a good game overall, which is really good for the HBCU game as a whole. So I think there's so many opportunities that are there for HBCU ball. It's just a matter of exposure and then just getting that right notoriety.
And then that exposure is only going to help their recruiting because, you know, kids start seeing them on TV, you know, and that the names are more prominent in their mind. I think this could be a really good thing. And I know that's what when I talked to Doug Williams, they were hoping that the Legacy Bowl will help create opportunities for guys to go into the league. But I think it also helped with the trickle up effect for guys from high school going to college. So it's going to be interesting to see how these pan out.
For sure. Yeah, I'm excited about it. Like I said, I've been talking to Steve Weish and Jim Trotter, and hopefully they'll let me on the committee there. I'm excited about that. I've been begging about that. So Jim or Steve, if you're listening, I'm still begging you again.
Good deal. Hopefully you get it on there. And then we have to have you back on here and you can give us some insight and some preview for that as well. Well, Jordan, I really appreciate your insight here for the draft. Glad to have you back on here. Again, I appreciate you making some time. Tell everybody real quick where they can find you and your work.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Jordan_Reid. That's at JORDAN_REID. You can find my work on thedraftnetwork.com. We have articles coming out every single day. And then also you can find my podcast on every single podcast platform. It's called The Reid Option. It's REID.
Good deal. Hey, man, thank you so much. And I'll be talking to you.
No problem. Thanks as always, Mike.
Hello, it's Tyler Roman, former NFL scout and host of the Roman Around the League podcast. Every week, I update my mock draft that not only looks at the best players available, but the needs for all first-round teams. The draft board keeps changing with all the movement this year, so tune into my show, Roman Around the League. That's ROMAN Around the League podcast. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast, and check out all of the great shows from Empire Media.
All right, thanks so much to Jordan for his time and his insight. This is what I do. I talk to a lot of different people to try to educate myself. And as you know, Chris Sims, who we had on a few weeks ago, very high on some of these guys. His order is different than Jordan Reid's. Jordan, he pointed out what he liked about certain guys, pointed out where they need to work on things and what questions he has. I'm not saying one's right, one's wrong, but this is just the nature of the game. Everybody's going to see something a little bit differently. I was talking to an NFL talent evaluator just last night about these quarterbacks because I've got a piece coming out on a number of them. Zach Wilson, Justin Fields, and then Mac Jones in the next several weeks. But this one guy, he said that he does think that Zach Wilson probably has the highest floor of any of these top quarterbacks in the draft. He does not think, however, that he's got the highest ceiling. He feels like, he would like if he was a little bit bigger. He's got a little questions about his durability. Also, his play in the pocket when things break down. He doesn't quite see him making those type of big-time throws. Yes, like Chris Sims mentioned, his ability to escape and make all kinds of different throws from different angles and platforms, but on a consistent basis, this guy had a question about that. I talked to another guy who is a scout who said, I see him as maybe a Jared Goff type, a guy who has a couple years in the league, reaches a point where you think maybe there's some promise, and then he kind of levels off. We saw Jared Goff help the Rams get to the Super Bowl, and then the 2 years since then, he really kind of leveled off, fell out of favor with his team, got traded. His reason for that was again, he mentioned pocket play as well. And the way that when things break down, doesn't see that poise in Zach Wilson's game that you would hope for. Yeah, he can make a lot of these different throws, but he felt like not as much substance as there is flash. So that's interesting to me. Is he indeed a guy that's going to be a Patrick Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers type, or is he a Jared Goff or Jimmy Garoppolo type of guy that, is decent, is good, but isn't going to take you to that next level? Meanwhile, the same guy who compared Zach Wilson to Jared Goff, he feels like Justin Fields should be the number 2 overall quarterback. Really sees him as the toughness, leadership, physicality, and playmaking ability. Yeah, it might take him a little bit just to adapt to an NFL offense, but he feels like he's got that potential. But this is what makes the draft so fascinating, is just that there are so many different opinions, and just like there are 32 different teams out there, and everybody's got a different scouting department, different general manager. Many of them see things differently, but it just takes one team to fall in love with the guy. We aren't really going to know, though, how great or accurate these projections were until 2, 3, maybe 4 years down the road. But that's why we love the draft, because there's all this promise and potential, and it's almost like a reality TV show, watching it all play out in front of us. Well, I hope you guys have a good one. Thanks so much for listening. Again, you can read me at usatoday.com. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at @ByMikeJones. Do me a favor and take this podcast, share it with some friends, encourage them to download and subscribe, and leave me a review. And I will talk to you guys again next week.